My name is Dulce Whitford, and for the first 28 years of my life, I was the family's greatest disappointment. Not the rebellious kind, not the scandalous kind, just the quiet, unremarkable kind, the daughter who sat at the wrong end of the dinner table, who struggled to read menus aloud, who needed 3 passes through a paragraph that Miranda absorbed in one blink. My parents had a word for me, delivered in the casual cruelty of passing conversation. Slow. They never shouted it. That almost would have been better. They whispered it in the careful, apologetic tones of people explaining a weather delay, unfortunate, but nothing to be done. My dyslexia was diagnosed when I was 7. The letters rearranged themselves on the page like they were playing a game I hadn't been invited to join. By 12, I understood that my parents weren't going to help me learn the rules. The year I turned 12, they hired Miranda a Princeton SAT tutor at $400 an hour. They enrolled her in French immersion. They drove her to Juilliard on Saturday mornings for violin. When I asked about getting help with reading, my mother Priscilla looked at me with an expression I would spend years trying to forget, not anger, just a soft, practiced exhaustion. Dulce, we've already spent so much on specialists. At some point, we have to accept that some children just aren't academic. I was 12, I believed her. So I built my own tools in the dark. Audiobooks became my oxygen. I developed systems of visual notes, color-coded diagrams, flowcharts that turned tangled paragraphs into maps I could actually read. What I couldn't absorb through words, I absorbed through patterns. And every Sunday afternoon, I took the one train uptown to my grandmother's apartment on the Upper West Side, where Eleanor Whitford sat across from me in a wingback chair and taught me everything my parents wouldn't. She never once picked up a textbook. Instead, she'd spread old contracts across her coffee table, original documents from the company she'd built from a single Brooklyn office in 1965, now a $92 million commercial real estate empire, and walk me through them like a tour guide through a cathedral. Not word by word. Structure by structure. Your father reads contracts like a lawyer, she told me once, smoothing a yellowed page with weathered fingers. He looks for what he can exploit. You read them like an architect. You see how all the pieces connect. I didn't fully understand what she meant. I would, but first I had to survive another 16 years of being the Whitford family's most politely managed secret. Christmas 2018. 20 relatives around the mahogany table in my parents' Upper East Side townhouse. Crystal chandeliers, catered lamb, the annual performance of Whitford family perfection. My father Gerald stood at the head of the table, wine glass raised, wearing his boardroom authority like a second skin. He announced that Miranda had been accepted to Harvard Law School, full scholarship. The room erupted. Aunt Catherine dabbed her eyes. Uncle Richard clapped Miranda on the back like she'd scored a winning goal. Then Gerald's gaze drifted down the long table, past the centerpiece, past the candles, all the way to where I sat. And Dulce, he paused. The warmth in his voice didn't fade gradually, it cut like a light switch. Well, Dulce is also here. Soft laughter. Uncomfortable, reflexive, the kind people produce when they don't know what else to do. Miranda laughed with them, she didn't hesitate. I stared at my plate, the roasted lamb blurred. I refused, absolutely refused, to let the tears fall. Under the table, a hand found mine. Thin fingers, papery skin. My grandmother, seated 2 chairs down, squeezed once. When I looked up, her eyes were fixed on her son with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not disappointment, not embarrassment. Fury, cold, controlled, absolute fury, directed at her own child. She said nothing that night, not a single word. But 3 months later, she called me to her apartment and said she needed to show me something important. She pressed a small mahogany box with brass hinges into my hands and told me to keep it safe, not to open it yet, and that when the time came, I would know. I took the box home, tucked it in the back of my closet, tried to forget the strange gravity of her words. I didn't forget, I never forgot. I just didn't know yet what I was waiting for. After graduating from a state university in 2022, not an Ivy, never an Ivy, I applied to work at Witford Properties. I wanted to prove I could contribute, that the family business could be my path too. My father agreed to hire me as an administrative assistant. Salary, $42,000 a year. That same month, Miranda joined as chief legal counsel. Her salary, $280,000 plus bonuses. My job consisted of photocopying documents, booking conference rooms, and fetching coffee. Fee for executives who never bothered to learn my name. I was not invited to a single meeting, not shown a single contract, not once included in a decision that affected a company my grandmother had built. But I watched and I listened. I discovered something about myself in those long, fluorescent hours in the copy room. I could see things. When executives talked deals in the hallway, I'd sketch the relationships between parties on napkins, the flow of money, the pressure points, the places where incentives misaligned. A coping skill I'd developed to survive my own brain had quietly become something else, something sharper. I just didn't know yet what it was worth. In April 2024, the email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Subject line, position restructuring, confidential. They were letting me go, effective July 1st. That evening, I stayed late pretending to file documents no one would look at. Through the thin wall between my cubicle and my father's corner office, voices drifted through. Gerald, can't have her here when Miranda takes over. It looks bad. The CEO's sister working as a secretary. Priscilla, we've done everything we could for her. Some children just don't have what it takes. Gerald, exactly. She needs to go. We'll give her generous severance, something more suited to her abilities. I pressed my palm flat against the wall and stood very still. $42,000 a year. My Queen's studio with 2 roommates cost $1,800 a month. No savings, no safety net. Lose this job, lose the apartment in 8 weeks. But it wasn't the money that turned the room cold around me. It was the understanding settling into my bones like January air. If I accepted their version of who I was, I would live inside it forever. Miranda's graduation party was tomorrow. I wondered what else my father had planned to announce. May 15, 2024, the Plaza Hotel Grand Ballroom. 350 guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. A 12-piece orchestra playing Gershwin. Crystal chandeliers throwing prisms across silk tablecloths. Gerald Whitford's kingdom, his stage, the theater where he performed the role of patriarch and mogul and man who had everything. My mother intercepted me at the entrance. Her gaze traveled from my drugstore makeup to my scuffed heels to my $79 Zara dress. Her lips pressed into a thin, familiar line. You couldn't find anything nicer. This is what I have. She adjusted her Cartier bracelet. You're at table 27, near the service entrance. Try not to draw attention. She leaned closer, Chanel No. 5 overwhelming in the narrow space between us. Tonight is Miranda's night. Whatever you're feeling, whatever resentment you think you're entitled to, keep it to yourself. Don't embarrass us. She walked away before I could answer. Table 27 was half hidden behind a pillar. From my seat I could see the stage, the massive portrait of Miranda in her Harvard regalia, the banner. Congratulations, Miranda Whitford, Harvard Law Class of 2024. And near the entrance, standing completely alone, a silver-haired man in a gray suit. Not mingling, not eating, just watching. His eyes found mine across the crowded room and something cold moved through me, not fear exactly, more like recognition, the feeling of a story arriving at its chapter. At 8:30 the orchestra stopped, the lights dimmed, Gerald took the stage. He announced that Miranda had graduated in the top 5% of her Harvard Law class, that she'd clerked for Justice Reynolds, that she'd made partner track at Sullivan and Cromwell in record time. His voice crested and swelled like a conductor reaching the finale. Then, tonight I'm not just celebrating her achievements, I'm announcing her future. Miranda joined him under the spotlight, radiant in emerald Valentino. Effective immediately, Miranda Whitford will inherit my entire estate. Our Park Avenue residence, valued at $13 million. And most importantly, a pause, long and deliberate, the pause of a man who knows how to command a room, the position of CEO of Witford Properties when I retire. 350 people rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous, physical, filling the gilded room to every corner. Not one face turned toward table 27. The cousin beside me, a woman I'd met at a funeral 8 years ago, leaned over. Dulce, right. So what does that mean for you? I opened my mouth, closed it, looked down at my hands. Across the room, the silver-haired man began moving toward me, slowly, deliberately, as though he had been waiting for this precise moment and had all the time in the world. He stopped at my table. Up close he was older than he'd appeared, early 60s, deep-set eyes, the careful posture of someone who had spent his life in courtrooms. Miss Whitford. That's me. My name is Jonathan Ellis. He produced a card from his breast pocket, cream-colored, embossed, Morais. Ann and Blake, attorneys at law. I was your grandmother's lawyer. The words landed like a struck bell. Eleanor passed 3 years ago. I'm aware. He reached inside his jacket and produced a cream envelope, heavy stock, sealed with red wax bearing a notary stamp. She left something for you, with very specific instructions about when to deliver it. What is this? Her will, the real one, his voice dropped, the one your father doesn't know exists. I stared at the stamp, Morrison and Blake, September 12, 2019, 5 months after she'd handed me the wooden box. She gave me explicit instructions, Ellis continued. I was to deliver this document on the day your father publicly disinherited you. He glanced toward the stage where Gerald and Miranda were still bathed in applause. I believe that just occurred. My hands trembled as I took the envelope. What's inside? For the first time, something almost like warmth crossed his face. Mrs. Eleanor told me to tell you, give this to Dulce on the day Gerald shows her exactly who he is. By then, she'll be ready. He straightened his tie. I'll be available when you have questions. He turned and walked back into the crowd, disappearing completely, as though he'd never been there at all. I couldn't breathe inside that ballroom. I pushed through the service entrance, found an empty hallway near the kitchen, stood under buzzing fluorescent lights with the sounds of 350 celebrating people reduced to a muffled hum. My fingers shook as I broke the red wax. 3 pages of dense legal text, a notarized signature, September 12, 2019. I read slowly, forcing the letters to stay still, forcing them to mean what they said. I, Eleanor Margaret Whitford, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous testamentary documents and declare this to be my last will and testament. My eyes snagged on a paragraph near the middle and would not let go. To my granddaughter, Dulce Ann Whitford, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Witford Properties LLC, currently valued at approximately $47 million, along with all voting rights associated therewith. I read it again and again. 51%, controlling interest. The will continued. This bequest is made with full knowledge of my son Gerald's treatment of Dulce. She has been excluded, diminished, and denied opportunity, not due to lack of ability but due to lack of support. Dulce is not slow. Dulce was abandoned, and I will not allow her father's prejudice to continue after my death. A sob caught at the back of my throat, and I pressed my hand over my mouth and held it there until it passed. She had seen. All those years, all those dinner tables, all those Christmas dinners with the practiced laughter and the careful dismissals, she had seen every single thing. At the bottom of the page, a condition. To activate this bequest, I must formally request an emergency board meeting within 72 hours of receiving this document. Failure to act within that window would render the will null and void, all assets reverting to the 2015 testament. 72 hours. The deadline fell at 8:30 p.m. on May 18th. My grandmother had left me a weapon. Now I had to decide if I was brave enough to pick it up. Jonathan Ellis was waiting by the coat check when I emerged. The 72-hour clause, I said. Why? Your grandmother knew you. He handed me a second card, his personal cell handwritten on the back. She knew that given unlimited time, you'd convince yourself not to act. The deadline isn't a punishment, Miss Whitford, it's permission. He checked his watch. You have 3 days. If you want to proceed, I can help you draft the formal request. Through the ballroom doors, I could still see my father on stage, basking, and my mother working the room. accepting congratulations as though she'd personally engineered every achievement being celebrated. If I did this, every relationship I had left would burn. But if I didn't, if I accepted their verdict one more time, I would spend the rest of my life as the thing they had always said I was. Not because I'd actually failed, because I'd never once been allowed to try. "I'll call you tomorrow," I said. "We're requesting that meeting." Ellis allowed himself a small, precise smile. "She said you would." That night, in my Queen's apartment, I finally opened the mahogany box. My roommates were asleep. Orange streetlight fell in stripes across my bed, where I sat cross-legged with the box in my lap. The brass hinges creaked softly as the lid came up. Inside, a handwritten letter on my grandmother's personal stationery, a faded document with a 1965 date stamp, and a USB drive, sleek, modern, clearly added much later than everything else. I reached for the letter first. "My dearest Dulce, if you're reading this, Jonathan has done his job, and your father has done exactly what I feared he would. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you while I was alive, but I can pee. Rodict you now." The enclosed document is the original partnership agreement from 1965, when I founded this company. Your father has never seen it. It establishes that the founder's shares carry permanent voting rights that cannot be diluted or transferred without board approval. The USB contains something else, something your father hoped I'd forgotten. In 2018, Gerald proposed a resolution to reduce my voting rights from 51% to 10%. His stated reason: I was too old to understand modern business. The real reason: he wanted control and I was in his way. The board rejected him by 2 votes. Mine was one of them. I never forgot what he tried to do, and I never forgave him for the way he used you to justify it, as though diminishing you somehow proved I was unfit. Use this wisely, Dulce, not for revenge, for justice. All my love. Grandma Eleanor. I plugged the USB into my laptop. One file, board meeting minutes March 2018, PDF. My father's voice, his boardroom voice, the one he used for difficult clients and disappointing children, had been captured by a small recording device his 81-year-old mother had placed on the table in front of her. Eleanor is 81 years old. She doesn't understand modern business. I moved to reduce her voting rights to 10%. I sat with that for a long time, then I started making calls. Margaret Coleman picked up on the second ring. Dulce Whitford. Her voice carried decades of cigarettes and real laughter. "I've been wondering when you'd call." She'd been on the Witford Properties board for 32 years. She and my grandmother had, as she put it, built half of Brooklyn together in the 70s. She already knew about the will. Eleanor had told her 3 years ago, right before the end. "An emergency board meeting requires 3 directors to sign the petition," Margaret said. "I'm one, you'll need 2 more. Can you help?" "I can do better," papers shuffled in the background. "Gerald Whitford isn't as popular as he thinks. At least 4 board members have expressed concerns privately. They just need someone to go first." A pause. "Richard Holloway, Susan Parker. They've both been on the wrong end of Gerald's temper in closed sessions. I'll make some calls." She cleared her throat. "Dulce, this isn't going to be pleasant. Your father will fight. Your sister will fight. They'll say terrible things. They've been saying terrible things my whole life. At least now I get to respond." Margaret laughed, warm, genuine, surprised. "Eleanor always said you had steel under all that quiet." The petition was filed by 10 o'clock that night. Emergency board meeting, May 18th, 10 a.m., Witford Tower, 42nd floor. Gerald found out at 4 the following afternoon. I know this because Miranda called me 45 minutes later, her voice strung wire-tight. "What did you do?" Not a question. "I don't know what you mean." "Dad just got a notice. Emergency meeting. Margaret Coleman hasn't requested anything in 15 years. Maybe she has concerns about management." "Don't play games with me, Dulce." Her composure cracked just slightly. "If you're trying to embarrass us." "I'm doing my job, Miranda, same as always." She hung up without saying goodbye. Through the wall of my cubicle 20 minutes later, I heard my father on the phone. Ridiculous waste of time. Dulce, Miranda, she can barely read a spreadsheet. She's not a threat to anyone. I smiled. For the first time in 28 years, being underestimated felt like an advantage. May 18, 2024, 9:45 a.m. The elevator opened onto the 42nd floor of Witford Tower. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Italian marble. Corporate opulence engineered to intimidate. I stepped out in a borrowed gray blazer 2 sizes too large, carrying a leather portfolio I'd found at Goodwill for $12. Miranda was already there. She looked immaculate, navy power suit, Hermes scarf, every inch the CEO's heir apparent. Her eyes traveled over me, and her smile arranged itself into something that was almost pity. Dulce, what are you doing here? I have information to present to the board. She laughed sharp, performative. About what? You work in the copy room. The nature of my presentation is confidential. You don't even know what ROI stands for. Return on investment. It's not complicated. Miranda's smile flickered. Our father appeared at the end of the hallway, flanked by 2 senior executives. He looked at me the way he always looked at me, like a stain he'd tried and failed to scrub out. Dulce, go back to your desk. Actually, a voice called from inside the boardroom. She belongs here. Margaret Coleman stood in the doorway, 72 years old, silver-haired, with the quiet authority of someone who had been building empires when Gerald Whitford was still in school. I invited her. She is standing to address the board. Gerald's jaw tightened. For a moment the hallway held its breath, but Margaret Coleman had been a board member for 32 years. Her authority in that room exceeded his, and every person in that corridor knew it. Fine, Ice, let her speak. We'll see how long it takes before she embarrasses herself. The boardroom was an oval of polished walnut and leather. 12 directors took their seats. Gerald sat at the head. Miranda positioned herself to his right, not yet officially a board member, but arranged like one. I was directed to a chair at the far end of the table, the corporate equivalent of table 27. In the corner, Jonathan Ellis sat with his briefcase. He caught my eye and nodded once. Robert Hartley, board chairman, called the session to order and gave the floor to Margaret, who rose briefly and then yielded her time to me. Every face in that room turned. Miranda smirked. Gerald leaned back with theatrical boredom. I stood. My hands were steadier than I expected. Thank you, Mrs. Coleman, and thank you to the board for allowing me to speak. I opened the portfolio. What I'm about to present may surprise some of you. I ask only that you hear the evidence before reaching conclusions. Gerald sighed audibly. I didn't look at him. I'm sorry. My father raised his hand, rising slowly, buttoning his jacket with deliberate theater. Before we waste the board's time, I need to offer some context. Dulce is my daughter and I love her, but she's not qualified to address this board on any business matter. She works in an administrative role, no legal training, no financial background, no strategic experience. Miranda's voice came in on cue, wrapped in practiced sympathy. Dulce also has dyslexia. She struggles with reading. We've tried to support her, but, an elegant shrug, some limitations can't be overcome with effort alone. A few board members shifted in their chairs. Mr. Whitford, Robert Hartley's voice cut through the room like a gavel strike. Miss Whitford requested this time. She's entitled to use it. Gerald sat. His expression was a very specific kind of promise. Miranda caught my eye and mouthed 2 words. You're embarrassing yourself. I looked at them both, my father, my sister, and felt something go very still inside me. Not anger, something colder, cleaner. They weren't trying to protect the company. They weren't even trying to protect themselves. They were trying to protect the story, the version where I was nothing. Thank you, Mr. Hartley. I won't be discussing my reading ability today. I placed the document on the table. I'll be discussing this. The room went silent. This is the last will and testament of a leaner Margaret Whitford, founder of this company, notarized September 12, 2019. Gerald's face drained of color so visibly that the board member beside him actually glanced over. That's impossible. His voice had changed entirely, the boardroom authority stripped out, something raw and disbelieving underneath. My mother's will was executed in 2015. I have a copy. You have a copy of her previous will. I kept my voice level. Clinical. Under New York Estates, Powers and Trusts law, a subsequent valid will automatically revokes all prior testamentary documents. This will was executed 4 years after the one you possess. Jonathan Ellis rose from his corner and confirmed every detail. His firm, the date, the independent notaries, the original held in escrow at Chase Private Client. Robert Hartley studied the document. His eyebrows rose slowly. This bequeaths 51% of Witford Properties shares. He looked up to you, Miss Whitford. Murmurs moved around the table. It's a forgery, Miranda's voice, but the confidence had gone out of it. I'd advise against making fraud accusations without evidence, Ellis said immediately. Morrison and Blake's reputation speaks for itself. My mother was ill. Gerald's voice had found its footing again. She was being manipulated. Perhaps, I said, you'd like to explain this. I pressed play on my phone. Gerald's voice filled the boardroom, his boardroom voice, the one he used for difficult clients. Eleanor is 81 years old. She doesn't understand modern business. I moved to reduce her voting rights to 10%. The silence afterward was absolute. That was a private board discussion, which Eleanor attended. I kept my voice even. She recorded it, as was her right as a shareholder. I looked directly at my father. The board rejected your motion by 2 votes. Hers was one of them. This recording doesn't just document what you tried to do, it documents that she was clear-minded enough to stop you. 4 months before she wrote the 2019 will. Robert Hartley set down the document. Something had shifted in his expression, not surprise anymore, but something harder and more deliberate. He called a 15-minute recess. 45 minutes passed. The board's legal counsel spent the entire time on the phone with Morrison and Blake, Chase Private Client, and the New York State Court's office. I sat alone at the end of the table. Jonathan Ellis brought me a glass of water. Margaret Coleman touched my shoulder briefly as she passed. Gerald and Miranda stood in the corner of the room in a heated, hissed conversation that grew progressively less controlled. When Patterson, the board's counsel, returned to the table and whispered in Robert Hartley's ear, Hartley's face moved through surprise and settled into something that looked like quiet inevitability. Please be seated. The room reassembled. Our legal counsel has confirmed the following. Hartley read from his notes without inflection. The will presented by Miss Whitford is valid under New York state law. It supersedes all previous testamentary documents. Effective immediately, Dulce Ann Whitford holds 51% of Witford Properties shares. Someone inhaled sharply somewhere to my left. Additionally, as majority shareholder, Miss Whitford has the right to propose motions to the board, including matters pertaining to executive leadership. Hartley looked at me. Miss Whitford, do you have any motions you wish to bring forward? I stood. Gerald rose from his seat, a vein visible at his temple. This is. Sit down, Gerald. Hartley's voice held unexpected steel. Miss Whitford has the floor. Gerald sat. His face had gone gray. I looked around the table at 12 people who had never, until this morning, considered me capable of anything beyond booking conference rooms. Now they were waiting. For me. The power to end my father's career was in my hands, and I thought about what my grandmother had written, not for revenge, for justice. I am not proposing to remove Gerald Whitford as CEO, I said. The tension in the room shifted completely. Miranda's head snapped up. Even Margaret looked surprised. What I am proposing is a vote of confidence. The board decides whether Gerald Whitford retains their confidence. If the majority votes no confidence, he resigns. If the majority votes confidence, I will not interfere with operational leadership during my tenure as majority shareholder. I paused. This is the same process Eleanor Whitford wrote into our bylaws 40 years ago. If my father has the board's confidence, he has nothing to worry about. This is a spectacle, Miranda said, but her voice had gone brittle. A revenge fantasy. It's corporate governance, I said. The same process that exists in every well-run company. Hartley looked at me for a long moment. Something like respect crossed his face. Is there a second? Seconded, Margaret Coleman didn't hesitate. All those expressing confidence in Gerald Whitford, as CEO, raise your hands. 4 hands. All those expressing no confidence. 7. Hartley counted, set down his pen. The motion carries 7-4 with 1 abstention. He turned to Gerald. Mr. Whitford, per section 14.3 of our bylaws, you have 30 days to tender your resignation. Gerald didn't move for a long time. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in my life. I'd braced for rage. What I saw was worse. It was recognition. The particular, devastating understanding of a man who had underestimated someone so completely, for so long, that the accounting had finally come due all at once. He stood, walked out without a word. The boardroom doors swung shut behind him. He was waiting in the private corridor. My mother Priscilla was with him, mascara streaked, her face crumpled in a way I had never seen before. She looked suddenly, shockingly human. You, Gerald's voice was barely controlled. Everything we built, you just. I didn't destroy anything. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I told the truth. Your grandmother was manipulated. That lawyer Ellis he must have. Elena wrote that will 5 months after you tried to strip her of power. I held my ground. She saw exactly who you were. You didn't lose because I betrayed you. You lost because you betrayed her. Priscilla stepped forward. Dulce, sweetheart, we were trying to protect you. You've always struggled. We didn't want to put pressure. You didn't protect me. You erased me. The words had been inside me for 20 years. They came out clear and quiet, without trembling. Every Christmas dinner, every family photo, every conversation where Miranda's achievements were announced like conquests and I was mentioned like an afterthought. That wasn't protection. That was abandonment. That's not fair. You're right, it wasn't. I met my mother's eyes. I spent my entire life trying to prove I was worthy of this family. I'm done proving. The documents speak for themselves. Gerald grabbed my arm. This isn't over, we'll contest the will. I pulled free. You'll lose, you know you'll lose, because she planned for every contingency, including this one. I walked to the elevator. I heard my mother's voice behind me. Dulce, wait. I didn't wait. For the first time in my life, I didn't need their permission to leave. The elevator doors closed on both their faces, and I leaned against the brushed steel wall and finally let myself breathe. The adrenaline that had carried me through the last 2 hours began to drain, and what replaced it wasn't triumph. It was grief. The particular, irreversible grief of watching a door close on something you'd spent your whole life hoping would open. I'd spent 28 years believing that if I was patient enough, quiet enough, good enough, my parents would eventually see me, love me the way they loved Miranda. That hope was dead now. I'd killed it myself. But standing in that elevator, I understood something my grandmother had tried to tell me years ago on a Sunday afternoon over old contracts spread across a coffee table. Some things you have to let die before you can build something real. May 19th, Gerald Whitford signed his resignation at 4 in the afternoon. I wasn't there. I learned about it through an email from Robert Hartley offering me a position, strategic advisor to the board, with full participation in major decisions. I forwarded it to Jonathan Ellis. His response arrived within an hour. Fair offer, no hidden strings. Congratulations, Dulce. That evening, an all-staff email went to the Witford Properties team. Effective June 15th, Gerald Whitford would step down. Dulce Whitford was welcomed as majority shareholder and strategic advisor. My phone buzzed with messages. Colleagues who had walked past my cubicle for 2 years without learning my name suddenly wanted coffee. I ignored most of them. One message I saved. Patricia Morales, executive assistant, had been with the company since 1987. She'd worked directly with my grandmother. Dulce, Elena used to talk about you constantly. She said you saw things others missed. I never understood what she meant until today. Welcome to the boardroom. She'd be so proud. Some validation doesn't come from family. Sometimes that's better. In June, my mother called and asked if we could meet for coffee. Just us. Neutral territory. She was already at the cafe when I arrived, her careful makeup unable to hide the exhaustion underneath. She looked older. She looked, for the first time, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. She said she wanted to apologize. I asked, "Are you apologizing because you're sorry or because everything changed?" She flinched. The question sat between us like smoke. "Both," she finally said. "I'm ashamed to say it, but both." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start, and a start, I decided, was enough for now. Miranda called in August. We met on a bench near Bethesda Fountain in Central Park. She looked different without the armor, dark circles, hair pulled back carelessly, the deliberate grooming of a woman who'd spent her whole life performing. She told me she'd been in therapy since May, 3 times a week. Being the golden child, she said, isn't actually a gift, it's a different kind of cage. We didn't become the sisters we'd never been, but we started becoming something, 2 people learning each other for the first time, without the performance, without the roles. Something honest, something that might, in time, become real. By November, I'd moved into my own apartment in Brooklyn Heights. 1 bedroom, pre-war building, a view of the bridge my grandmother had walked across to her first office in 1965. On the wall, I hung her portrait, the same one that had watched over the boardroom for 40 years. My new title, Director of Sustainable Development. A division I'd proposed myself, focused on green building practices and environmental impact, the kind of innovation Elena would have championed if she'd lived to see the world that needed it. My salary, $185,000 a year plus dividends. Some evenings I sit across from her portrait and talk to her. Not out loud. But she's there in the room, in the brass hinges of the box I keep on my desk, in the contracts I still read like architecture, in the way I move through the company she built from nothing. You did it, Grandma. You gave me the tools, I just had to be brave enough to use them. Looking back, I understand something now that I couldn't have understood at 27. My grandmother didn't leave me 51% of her company because I was better than Miranda. She left it to me because she trusted me not to become what power had made my father. She had watched for decades as credentials replaced character in that family, as degrees became weapons and worth became performance. She wanted someone at the helm who remembered where the company had come from, 1 Brooklyn office. 1 woman who believed that how you treated people who couldn't fight back was the only resume that actually mattered. Dyslexia isn't my flaw. It is part of who I am, the same way my visual memory is part of who I am, and my patience, and my ability to see the structure beneath the surface when everyone else is reading th. Words. The things that made me slow in my parents' eyes were the same things that made me see the truth when everyone around me was too invested in the story to look. Gerald judged worth by credentials, by degrees, by how well you performed in rooms like the ones he filled. Elena judged worth by character, by kindness, by who you were to people who had no power to reward you for it. And now, finally, I get to judge my own worth. Not by what my parents say, not by what my sister achieved, not by what anyone outside these walls decides to believe about a woman who took longer than average to read a room. By my own standard, my own measure, my own truth. That's the real inheritance my grandmother left me. And no one can ever take it away.